Sound. All right, we're here. And can they hear that online? Are you tracking that? All right, hopefully everybody can hear it. Oh, we got a thumbs up in the back. Okay, well, let's start this again. My name is John Brewer. Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. It is great to be here, and thank you for the conference organizers in inviting me here to talk to you about leader versus manager versus boss hole. I have a question for you. I want you to think about the best manager you've ever had, the best leader, manager in your career, and I'd like you to think of an adjective that describes that person, all right? A word, something that, is definitive about what that person was like, a really good manager. Just shout them out. Supportive, what else? Fair, compassionate, caring, listener, good. What else? Kind, understanding, excellent. Those are the kind of people we love to have leading our teams and managing our people. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum. And it is the spectrum, by the way. Let's think about the other side of it. This is what we at Real Good Ventures call the boss holes. All right. And when you think about really bad managers and people that have been just ineffective in that particular role, what are the words you think of then? Condescending. There's a lot more of them. Control, what? Closed-minded? Dictator. Smug, arrogant. Yes, yes. Okay, so we can see this contrast, right? We always, and in our work, we always want to help work, in the work we do with managers, we want to help them elevate themselves to where they are reflecting those types of adjectives, those types of descriptors, if you will. But all too often, managers drift into the boss hole zone. It absolutely happens. And by the way, even the very best managers, even leaders, have found themselves in the boss hole zone. Our job is to help get them out of there. And my remarks and what I'd like to share with you today is just some of the work that we're doing around Bosshole Prevention, all right, and Bosshole Intervention. All right. And by the way, for any of you that are a little bit shocked or maybe a little bit put off by the word boss hole, it actually is perfect, isn't it? I know you're chuckling, but it's perfect. You say the word boss hole and it's like, I know what that means. I absolutely know what that means. And when you start to think also about the people that we encounter in organizations, and now, and quite frankly, it happened before the pandemic when people were leaving organizations in droves. The reason they leave are the boss holes. There's absolutely no question about it. So I'm here to share with you the distinction between a leader, a manager, and a boss hole, and start to share with you some of the practical things you can do to help keep our managers and hopefully those managers and supervisors in this room out of the boss hole zone. Now, there's no shame if we've ever found ourselves in the boss hole zone. We just need to get out of it. But there's some very practical ways that we can do it. I'm going to share with you some of the things that we do at Real Good Ventures, but these are things that I guarantee you in your own organizations you can begin to do as well. All right. By the way, we also realized that you could take the word whole and put any noun or pronoun before it, and it works. Parent whole, coach whole. Yeah, I mean, it just absolutely works. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to discuss today. I'm just not getting a response from this. So we're going to move to the next slide. All right, thanks. I may just have to do that, guys. All right. So at Real Good Ventures, we have a very simple mission. Our mission is just very specific around helping people find meaning and fulfillment in their work. All right, that's our mission, because life is way too short to be miserable in what we're doing. Would you agree with that? Yes, it absolutely is. And I think there's a lot of suffering going on in the world, the work world, unnecessarily. And we are here to help alleviate that. Now, the way we do it is through something called talent optimization. Talent optimization, if you wouldn't mind hitting the next slide, this is going to build up. Talent optimization, quite frankly, is the matching your talent strategy with your business strategy to get the results you need. And you can just go ahead and cycle through this, Scott. Your talent strategy to your business strategy to get the results you need. Now, there are 4 aptitudes within it, but I'm going to point out one particular. There's diagnose. Diagnose simply means that we measure everything going on in an organization. Anybody watch the movie Moneyball? Billy Beane, he's, I think, currently the general manager still of the Oakland Athletics. It's a great story. Billy Beane and I spoke at the same conference a few years ago. He was a keynote. I was not a keynote, but I get to say we spoke at the same conference. But when I sat in his session, he said this, and this was so profound. He says, data makes transparent all difficult decisions. And all people decisions are typically pretty difficult, aren't they? But if we have data, if we have objective data, it allows us to make those decisions objectively. So we diagnose everything that we do. That's one of the aptitudes of talent optimization. Next is designing. Designing means we can actually design teams for flawless execution. We have a saying that every team is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. The question is, are they the results we need? So you know the time when you're frustrated, you may be, on a team or leading a team, and the team just doesn't seem to really gel around the objective, and they just don't seem to be executing very well. Well, that's because you probably have a team that is designed for something else. So let's not blame them. Let's figure out how to optimize the team. The third one is going to be the inspire aptitude. This is the one that helps keep managers out of the boss hole zone. This is where we put in managers' hands actual tools based on their superpower and the superpower of the people on their team, so they understand what they're doing. Now, we have a couple of tools we use in particular, but I just want to tell you, in your organizations, if you're using any particular psychometric, any particular assessment that helps to reveal what we call behavioral DNA, it'll work. You just can't use them like a parlor trick. This science has been around since the 1950s. And if we apply it correctly, it helps managers be far more effective than they have in the past. Then the final one is the higher aptitude. The higher aptitude helps us understand how to optimize fit when we're hiring people. Okay, we have a phrase at Real Good Ventures, and the phrase is this: people are hired for what they know, and they're fired for who they are. I want you to let that sink in. We see somebody's resume, and by the way, the resume, credentials, their background, worst predictor of performance. It absolutely gives you no predictor of performance. So people are hired for, what they know. Wow, did you see where they went to school? Did you see where they worked? Do you see their certification? And then you get to know them, and you get to know how they're wired, and that's when they get fired. Or it's like later, it's like, oh my gosh, we hired this person. They're like a disease. They're like destroying this team. They're toxic. Who's ever had that happen? Yes, hopefully we've never been the source of that. But if you've ever been sub-optimized or misfit in a role, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So this is talent optimization leads to what we call talent economics. In other words, what are the financial gains to be recognized when we apply talent optimization? Now, as I said before, this is a framework. And this framework is designed to help you access the data within your organizations, people data, people science, to be able to make it work. So if we'd hit the next one, this is our world at Real Good Ventures. And by the way, this is not an endorsement of any one of these particular diagnostics. I share this with you because in order to make talent optimized, we need to have data. So one of the main ones we use is the Predictive Index up there. I know some of you have taken a PI assessment. Line of sight allows us to measure strategic alignment at every level in the organization. EQI 2.0 measures emotional intelligence. Now remember that one. EQ is really critical when it comes to helping managers learn to adapt and become more effective with the people on their team. We also have something called the Fearless Organization. This measures psychological safety. And I'm going to talk about psychological safety as I conclude, simply because psychological safety, when it comes to the health of an organization, it is the soil. It is not the seed. Okay. I want you to remember that. It is the soil to help organizations be healthy, but it is not the seed. The seed are things like trust, accountability, relationships, reality testing. All right. But the psychological safety is absolutely critical. And then finally, and it's really not a product that we use, but it's a result of it. That's our podcast, the Bosshole Chronicles. Now, this is going to sound like a shameless plug for the Bosshole Chronicles for you to listen to. We'd love for you to listen to it. But I'm going to tell you right now, the stories, it's not to make fun of boss holes. It's not to be mean or vindictive. Nobody uses any real names when they're telling their boss hole stories. But I'm going to tell you right now, there's some real suffering going on in the work world. It's real. And this is why the misery index, why people are leaving, and they are seeking, and they will seek out a lower level of misery, if you will. And you want to know something? It is so avoidable. all of this. I mean, it is so avoidable when we help our leaders and our managers understand what their role is and how to stay out of the Bosshole zone. Fair enough? Does that make sense? Okay. Now, let's hit the next one, please. That's my partner, Sarah Best. She's amazing and absolutely gifted when it comes to the work around executive development and also her work around emotional intelligence. But once again, like I said, you can listen to it, but this is also an invitation. We have people constantly contacting us saying, I don't want to use my real name or the Bosshole's real name, but I would love to tell this story. And we welcome that. So if anybody has a Bosshole story, and everybody does, and you want to share it with our listeners, we've been on podcasting for about 1.5 years. Just reach out to me, John at Real Good Ventures. Happy to get you on. But if we could go ahead and hit the next one. Thank you. I just also want to show you that this is a legitimate T-shirt. This was posted. Actually, one of our colleagues posted this on. I just put this up here because I thought it was fun. Just because, we also oftentimes get the question: are leaders born or are they made? They're not born. Okay. And unfortunately, in our world, we start to look at certain characteristics in a person and say, wow, that person's a leader because they're assertive and proactive and comfortable with risk. That does not make a leader. Anybody can be a leader, but not everybody wants to be a leader. Anybody could be a manager, but not everybody wants to be a manager. But what do we do in our organizations? We push people into the Bosshole zone because we say, hey, you're really good at that one thing you do by yourself. We're going to put you in charge of other human beings. That makes no sense. There's no correlation. So I'm going to share with you some of the lessons we've learned about keeping people out of the Bosshole zone after we talk about the leader versus the manager versus the Bosshole. All right, let's hit the next one. So in our world of behavioral analytics, we like to look at every individual uniquely. There are, in the work that we do, we are able to generate what are called reference profiles. And you can see the icons above the people here on the screen. Now, why is that important? Why is that relevant? Well, it just simply helps us understand that everybody is a little bit unique and they bring something unique to the organization, just as they bring something unique to a leadership role or a manager role. So if we hit the next one, please. What I want to do is start to talk about the dichotomy, if you will, of a smart versus a healthy organization. So on the left-hand side here, and we'll look at the right-hand side in a second, this is, and by the way, this is, does anybody know Patrick Lencioni, 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, or The Advantage? Okay, go get that book, Five Dysfunctions of a Team. It's an amazing book. It's a parable. The Advantage is also an amazing book, but he talks about the difference between being smart and healthy. Now, smart up here is all about having the best technology, having a strong strategy, being lined out and optimized with your marketing, finance, operations, and production. This is where these are more practical, more measurable elements within an organization. And so when you start to think about it, that can constitute a very smart organization. Healthy is very different. If you wouldn't mind hitting it to the next one. Healthy organizations are known for having minimal politics, low confusion. In other words, people understand what they're there to do, and they understand their role in the organization, high morale, and then the big 3, engagement, retention, and performance. Those are the big things people are talking right now, especially engagement and retention. Now, here's the thing. Can you have a highly successful, profitable, from the outside's world profitable, or if that's what you're looking for, or you can have an organization that delivers its services as effectively as possible and be very smart and yet be incredibly unhealthy? The answer is yes. I mean, we have a lot of smart organizations in our sphere that are incredibly unhealthy. What we want to do is find both. But notice the one on the right has everything to do with people. Now, this thing on the left has to do with people as well, but they're more mechanical, they're more tactical, if you will. The one on the left is where we really want to involve people. So, how does this manifest itself in the world of work? Well, every organization represented here faces what we call 4 forces of disengagement. So if we could hit the next slide. Ultimately, what we want out of every individual, and this includes leaders, managers, and individual contributors, we want them, see the green person? Over time, we want to increase engagement, retention, and performance, right? and we want them to move in that positive trajectory. We also have people, what we call the disengaged or the actively disengaged, that are down here. They do things just because they have to. Minimum requirements. All right. They come in, they punch the clock, they do their work, they leave. See that dotted line? We call that the line of discretionary effort. And our job as leaders and managers and organizations is to help elevate people above the line of discretionary effort. Does that make sense? All right. But we face the 4 forces of disengagement, and here they are. And by the way, the sequence is absolutely critical. And I know you will get these slides as a result of this, but if you wouldn't mind hitting the next one. First of all is job fit. The very first step in trying to push against the forces of disengagement is job fit. How many of us in this room have had a job in your career, hopefully it's not this one, and you just know, man, I am just not wired for this. Anybody ever have that? Everybody's had that, okay? All right. When we can optimize job fit, that's when we find engagement and retention going up. All right. But we do it through science. All right. We don't guess. Guessing is outlawed in our world. And especially when we have leaders or managers that go, and I got a lot of these that go, hey, I know that science stuff is interesting, but I know people. I got a good feel for people. I just know. And you want to know something? That's just total BS. It's total BS. Because, and I oftentimes quote Deming, Edwards Deming, when he says, in God we trust, everybody else bring data. Okay, so when I ever hear an executive or a manager or a supervisor go, trust me, trust me, trust me, I know people, I throw that aside because it never works. Guessing never works. Second one is manager fit. This is why keeping managers out of the boss hole zone is so critical. We have been putting people into management and supervisory roles for a century or better without the proper direction, without equipping them. All right? It happens all the time. And this is one of the easiest things organizations can do. If you're thinking about moving somebody into a position of management or supervising people, first thing you ought to do is ask them, do you even want to do this? And I've had a lot of people say, I have no interest in it, but you know what? It's the only way to move up in this organization. That's another one of the problems that we're going to talk about to keep people out of the boss hole zone. Third one is team fit. Teams can be optimized. Teams can be designed for optimal performance. And then we have culture fit. Now, the reason I share this with you is very simple. Culture is a result. It is not a remedy. How many of your organizations have been talking about in the last couple of years, culture? Culture. We want to have this culture. We want to do this kind of culture. I think that is a noble pursuit, but culture is a result of job fit, manager fit, and team fit. You cannot artificially create a culture in your organization. I don't care how hard you try. All right. And oftentimes when managers and supervisors try, they find themselves drifting into the boss hole zone and they're going to fail miserably. Now, let's talk more specifically about our managers and our supervisors and how we have to help them stay out of the boss hole zone. Scott, if you wouldn't mind hitting the next slide. When we start to do our work, we oftentimes talk about a person's superpower, okay? And their superpower is really woven into their behavioral DNA, and we can measure that. But the reason I share this with you is that first and foremost, managers and supervisors and leaders have to have a heightened degree of self-awareness. Stanford Business Advisory Council says that self-awareness is the #1 competency for effective leadership. #1. There are a lot of other competencies that are critical, but self-awareness is #1. I've met a lot of managers and supervisors, boss holes, that are lacking self-awareness. You know what I'm talking about? Okay. And until that self-awareness is codified in that individual, they are going to drift into the boss hole zone. And then once we have that, then they can understand the others around them. They can understand their team. And only at that time do we want them to take action. So when we start to think about leader versus manager versus boss hole, this doesn't happen by accident. We can be very, very intentional about helping people understand who they are. But more importantly, let's just even find out if they want to manage and guide other people. All right? That's what we should be asking before we even move somebody into a supervisory position. Not because they were great at the one thing they did as an individual contributor, but because they're great at developing people. When we're working with clients, We asked them for every management and supervisory position, we asked them to modify the job description by doing this. Every single one. The very first line in a job description for a management or supervisory role should be this: developing other people. How many of you, don't show my hand, I want you to ask yourself, do we even have that in our management and supervisory job descriptions? Being very clear, developing other people. That begins a change in getting people out of the boss hole zone. Okay, now let's talk about leader versus manager versus boss hole. So let's hit the next one, Scott. Thank you. So a leader, these are definitions that I like to use when we're starting to talk about leaders versus managers versus boss holes. A leader is, well, a person in leadership is in a state of influence with other people. And it has nothing to do with whether or not they have authority over other people. So it is not tied to a position or a role, based on trust and credibility, capacity to create psychological safety. Remember and I'm going to define psychological safety shortly. It's different than coercion and charisma. Obviously, it's different than coercion. You force somebody to do something, you make them do something, that's not leadership. Okay, that's authoritarian. That's command and control. And that's an old model through which many of us were brought up. Okay, the command and control management style. That's not leadership. And then finally, EQ is usually evident. In other words, this person demonstrates emotional intelligence. They demonstrate things like empathy, impulse control, self-awareness. I mean, those are just 3 of the 26 elements of emotional intelligence. So leadership is something that's unique. You can't bestow leadership on somebody. What happens is you find yourself in a state of influence with other people. Does that make sense, that distinction? Okay, so now let's look at something that's a little bit more familiar. Let's look at the manager role. The manager, if you wouldn't mind hitting the next one, is a position of authority over another person. So this just is a little bit more reminiscent of our old model of the hierarchy. So I'm a manager, I've got my team, I've got authority, directly tied to one's position or role. Trust may or may not be established. All right, and by the way, trust, I just edited one of our upcoming episodes of the Bosshole Chronicles with a gentleman by the name of Rodney Eason. Rodney is an amazing HR, he's an amazing HR professional, but he talks about how in his organizations, he is always working specifically with managers to help them understand the necessity of trust. And I mean like authentic, vulnerability-based trust. That's when you can establish that. That's when magical things seem to happen, but it's not magical at all. You have created this level of trust with your direct reports. Psychological safety may be present and EQ may be evident. But here's the thing. The reason that we push managers into the boss hole zone is because they have no alternative. So in our world, remember, we've been brought up on certain models of organizations and hierarchies. Who can finish this phrase for me? Oftentimes when we talk about advancement in an organization, we talk about climbing the corporate right, okay? That's a mistake. That is an old operating system, an old model. Because if somebody wants to advance, the default is, I've got to manage other people, right? Big mistake. So what we are advocating is organizations need to have a very comprehensive and intentional track for the individual contributor. And that means that if I hire on as an analyst of some sort or a coordinator of some sort, there are 5 different levels of analyst or coordinator that I can achieve in my career, which comes with accreditation or certification and the opportunity to earn more money. But the organization has to be very thoughtful about building that out. I just spoke at Sarah and I spoke at a conference in Boston a couple of weeks ago. We had about 200 people in the room. And I asked this question: how many of the organizations in the room had an actual comprehensive pathway for individual contributors? How many people raise their hand, do you think? One person, half-heartedly. I mean, she almost didn't want to raise her hand. She kind of goes, we do, kind of. So that tells us we are missing a huge opportunity to keep managers out of the boss hole zone. So organizations inadvertently put people into the boss hole zone because they don't have any other pathway. Does that make sense? Now, I've got two sons, two amazing sons. They live here in Columbus. Had dinner with them last night. And Paul he works for a huge agribusiness. He's in operations. He is in the logistics side of the business. And they've asked him on a couple of times if he has an interest in managing people. And he said, no, thank you. But they have him on a track to develop him as an individual contributor. He's not, shamed because he doesn't want to go into management. We need to honor that pathway of individual contribution. And by the way, it should be super wide. Management pathway should be narrow. Individual contributor pathway, very, very wide. Does that make sense? So if there is one way organizations from today can make a substantive impact on keeping people out of the boss hole zone, start to create individual contributor pathways. Work with your human capital, your HR groups, and figure out how to make this work. We've got some episodes around that, but the thing is that there's plenty of supporting material that allows that to happen within a talent optimized organization. All right, let's now look at the boss hole. So the boss hole is none of these. And I just want to point out, we worked with plenty of executives, plenty of managers and supervisors that have found themselves in each one of these categories. You can have a manager that is a leader, okay? You can have a leader that is not a manager, and both can find themselves in the boss hole zone very, very easily, sometimes by virtue of what the organization does, and sometimes by something that they do. But it's always possible to get out. So what is a boss hole? Boss hole does not establish trust or credibility with his or her team. Secondly, there is a lack of psychological safety. Psychological safety, I'm going to define for you in just a second, but like I said, it's the soil where growth and development and team success can actually flourish. EQ is not evident. In other words, this boss hole is not really showing signs of emotional intelligence, ill-equipped to develop others, or actually has no interest in developing other people, and often no fault of their own, because they've been put in a leadership role or a management role for which they are ill-suited. Does that make sense? Now, I want to talk to all the managers and supervisors in the room. And I'm not going to have you raise your hand, but I'm going to ask you this question. Do you love being a manager and a supervisor? Do you really enjoy overseeing other people? And I know some of you are going, I really don't. I know. That's exactly what I've had that happen so many times when a manager and supervisor comes up to me after something like this, or we're doing a workshop and goes, I don't want you to get me wrong. I love my people. I hate my job. I was doing this work by myself really well. And I had, I loved it. I was fulfilled doing this work. And then they made me a manager. And now I'm responsible for everybody else. This is another way to keep people out of the boss hole zone. Do not shame or do not embarrass or make them feel less than if somebody wants to step out of supervisory positions. Honor that. If somebody comes forward and says, I got to tell you something, this wasn't for me. And that's actually a great way to even give people a test run in management. Keep them out of the boss hole zone. Say, hey, listen, for 6 months, I'm going to just have you oversee this team. Just a couple of people. Just to put your foot in the water, see because I see things in you and I want to see if you have an interest in developing people. Well, I do. I have no training or expertise with it. We'll provide that. But you know what? If it doesn't work, no harm, no foul, we're going to bring you back into your individual contributor role. That's how we create trust. That's how we create engagement. And that's how we keep our talent. When you create that level of psychological safety within the organization. Does that make sense? So you're thinking, whoa, John, that got kind of heavy. Yikes. This is after lunch. I wanted to be kind of uplifted. Well, I'm telling you right now, I'm so tired. I'm so tired of all the leadership and amazing things that you can do. Anybody can do anything in an organization. That's just total crap. All right. Let's be very realistic. I believe in what every individual is capable of doing, but there are 17 different unique characteristics. And if we can tap into those, I want to see people flourish. I want to see everybody in this room find meaning and fulfillment in their work. But it will not happen if we don't break the old models that keep creating the Bosshole zone. Is that resonating? Is that making sense? Okay, I'm seeing some, yeah, okay, or we're digesting right now. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So, what is a Bosshole? Bosshole, more specifically, poor understanding of the role of the manager, absence of clear expectation and preparation and training, insufficient feedback and input from director and manager. By the way, good takeaway for managers and supervisors in here. Feedback is not something you give exclusively. You want to draw it out. In other words, we have a saying, feedback is the oxygen of engagement. So oftentimes managers and supervisors feel like, well, I got to give you feedback. Well, what you should be doing is getting feedback. How am I doing? There's some very simple ways to do that to create trust and credibility with your direct reports. Sit down with them informally and say, hey, listen, I got 2 questions for you. Number 1, what are the things that I'm doing that help you? Okay, that support you. And secondly, what are the things that I'm doing that hold you back? Have that conversation, and don't be afraid of it. Don't be afraid of what they're going to say, because all it's going to do is help you, strengthen you as a leader, as a manager, and possibly strengthen that relationship. Another one, lack of self-awareness and lack of adaptation of natural behavioral drives. That's something that we can measure. In other words, we got to keep managers from saying, well, that's just who I am. And that happens a lot. I've had managers say, hey, they just got to get used to me. That's just who I am. They got to figure me out. Really? Really? In this day and age, you're going to say that to me? Because I'll tell you what, there are plenty of other organizations that have healthier, smarter atmospheres and cultures where that's not going to cut it. And they're going to go find somebody who will build them up. All right, let's hit the next one, please. So what are some of the lessons? I wanted to share with you some of the lessons that we've learned from the Bossholes. And we picked 6. I picked 6 for this discussion just because when we can keep managers and supervisors and leaders out of the Bosshole zone, then we can actually start to see them become that positive influence and catalyst within an organization. We can start to see engagement levels, which we can measure, go up. Retention levels go up. The talent economics of where we are hemorrhaging money and funds and fees, and our organizations are you can feel the lack of health. We want to get that toxicity out there, and the linchpin are our managers and our supervisors and our leaders. So number 1, the problem is systemic. It's just not the individual. I've already demonstrated that organizations will oftentimes create Bosshole zones inadvertently, and it's something that can be changed. What to do? Create that pathway for individual contribution and never force somebody into a management role because they're a great individual contributor. Secondly, change your concept of the manager. Change your job description of the manager. A manager should be number one responsibility, developing other people. Everything else is secondary. If you are not a people developer, if this person is not a people developer, why would you put them in a management role? Why would you put them in charge of 4, 5, 6, 10 other living, breathing human beings? You just don't want to do that. All right. Third one, stop promoting the wrong people. Go through the exercise of understanding what does our culture support in terms of leadership and substantial management practices that are favorable for our organization, and make sure the people that you're considering are prepared for it, have an interest in it, and you elevate them. So this is where we talk about upskilling. So people management is for those who's, okay, by the way, who's managing people in here? Show of hands, a lot of them. It's hard work. Would you agree with me? It is super hard work. And you want to know something? It is a huge responsibility. And I took, as a manager of people, I take that very, very seriously. And I don't want to be just good at it. I want to be excellent at it. And that is a lifelong pursuit. But if you don't want to do that, let's give our people an opportunity to go back to individual contribution and make sure we are promoting the right people. Fourth one, trust, psychological safety are absolutely foundational. I'm going to talk about psychological safety in just a second. EQ is a non-negotiable factor. Emotional intelligence. Now, emotional intelligence is one of those things that sounds very, soft and fuzzy and theoretical. It's not. If anybody's ever done EQ work in here, emotional intelligence, it is how we help managers and leaders adapt. Because I just want to tell you something. You are never going to change people. Okay. You know, I've had managers and supervisors say, yeah, but I think I can change them. And it's like, whoop, time out. You will never change people. People do not change. Okay. Circumstances change. People adapt to the circumstances. Does that make sense? But when you force them to adapt in a way that is so contrary to who they are, what do we get? Anxiety, stress, burnout, disengagement, and worse yet, active disengagement. Who knows what active disengagement is? Yes, sir. Okay, so getting other people disengaged. I'm repeating it just so our Zoomers out there can hear that. Okay, good. I have another definition for it. That's true. It's the sort of pull people together. Active disengagement is sabotage and subversion. 17%, according to Gallup, 17% of the American workforce is actively disengaged. That means 17% of your people are acting in subversive ways against the organization, possibly drawing in other people. And you're thinking, why don't they just leave? I know they don't. That's the problem. So why don't we try to elevate that engagement? And engagement we define as a person's emotional commitment to the organization and its goals. So by the way, let's think about this. If you invited, statistically, about 53% of the American workforce is disengaged. All right. 17% is actively disengaged. So let's say you had a dinner party and you invited 10 people. There are about 4 of them that want to be there. There are about 5 of them that don't want to be there, but they want to see what's going on. And at least 1 or 2 that are thinking about poisoning the food. That's what it is. Just transfer it that way. Okay. Last one is decisions are backed by reliable data. We should never be making people decisions. Managers and supervisors and leaders never making people decisions without reliable data. And again, I'm not advocating one particular platform or psychometric or diagnostic. We use them all the time. I know you are familiar with them, but if you're not, get familiar with them because those are going to help navigate all those, those difficult people decisions are made transparent by data. All right. So let's move to the next one. This is where I want to talk to you about, okay, Bosshole Prevention, really quick. I talked about these. Make the role of managers crystal clear, developing other people, make self-awareness a standard part of personal development, actively seek honest feedback regularly, check engagement levels, consider refitting boss holes in roles that are better for them. Yeah, so you could be a manager or a supervisor and just be in the wrong role, but you could be a great manager in a different role. That's okay. You just may be in the wrong role. Okay, let's refit people and then provide boss holes with ongoing management, leadership development with data. Okay, this is really where I wanted to go. I wanted to talk about psychological safety, and then Scott, you can hit the next one too. So here's the definition of psychological safety. Psychological safety is the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. There is low interpersonal fear and a high degree of comfort to challenge the status quo. Now, the book from which this whole diagnostic was taken is called The Fearless Organization by Dr. Amy Edmondson. Super interesting book. Go ahead and get that one. It's a great read, but she did her work in a medical environment, healthcare environment, with doctors and support staff, okay, nurses and nursing practitioners. And what she found out was totally contrary to what she expected. The teams that had the most complaints or identified the most problems actually had the highest performance because there was psychological safety within the team. An example she uses is a nurse who knew a physician was prescribing medication that could kill the patient. And she debated whether to say anything. I mean, she knew she should say something, but she was afraid because of the physician's potential retribution. Does that make sense? She spoke up. And what they found out is that the more people feel comfortable and safe to speak up, the better the performance. So we've got to have managers and leaders that are adult enough and mature enough and evolved enough and self-aware enough to be able to elicit psychological safety. All right. Now, another way to look at this, let's hit the next one, Scott, is that, and I just want you to think about these two terms, dangerous silence and avoidable failure. These are the dangers of low psychological safety. People don't say anything. It's like, I'm not saying anything. I'm not going to say anything. You say something to so-and-so. Or the avoidable failure. It's like, you know what? Let's not even try that because it's probably going to be bad. Try nothing new and don't say anything. These are so dangerous for organizations. And the really interesting thing is that, and I want you to think about this, where do you find yourself on the scale of psychological safety? Hit the next one, please, because these are the drivers of psychological safety. The three things that help to support it are team relationships, which we can curate and diagnose, leader behavior, and organizational climate or culture. All right, see where this is coming full circle. So remember, you've already got that pressure pushing down of the four forces of disengagement. So if we can alleviate that, we can nurture this sense of psychological safety within our teams and the leaders of those teams. So let's take a look at it this way. On this matrix right here, you can look at a comparison of psychological safety from low to high, and then performance accountability from low to high. So when both are low, when we have no psychological safety, okay, there is interpersonal fear for speaking up, and nobody's really held accountable, we're in the apathy zone. Okay, it's like, whatever. You know, remember that line of discretionary effort? I'm just coming in and punching the clock. This is the apathy zone. Now, let's just say, and I want nobody raise your hand, but I want you to think, oh, where am I? Are we in the apathy zone? And I want you to think about your specific team. Look now at high psychological safety and low performance accountability. Scott, if you would hit the next one. This is the comfort zone. So I feel very safe saying something to my teammates or my manager and supervisor and say, hey, this is wrong. We ought to do this, or I want to challenge this, but there's no accountability. This is the comfort zone. We got it on cruise control. Are any of these starting to seem a little bit familiar? Can you think about teams on which you've been a member and it's like, oh yeah, we were definitely in here. Remember, this is dynamic. You know, teams gravitate and move in and out of these things at different times. Now let's look at high accountability and no psychological safety. I think this is where a lot of organizations are right now. Low psychological safety, but by golly, you better perform. This is the anxiety zone. This is what creates suffering and pain in an organization. All right. This is where people feel anxiety and something that we are measuring constantly, burnout. All right. And I will tell you right now, the pandemic, you know what, my philosophy on the pandemic is that, and Lord knows, I hope we don't endure something like that in the future, but two takeaways from the pandemic. This stuff existed before the pandemic got here. Okay. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not blame everything on the pandemic. The pandemic exacerbated it. It was like pouring fuel on a spark and it just ignited. All right. Second takeaway is this: shame on us if we are not prepared for the next thing. Because if the pandemic proved anything, and the reason that there is a groundswell of people leaving their jobs, the great resignation, the big quit, we call it the big refit, it's because our leaders and our supervisors and our managers were ill-equipped to deal with the impact of the pandemic. Not universally, not everywhere, but for the most part. And so I want you to think about what do we need to do next to prepare our leaders and our managers for the inevitable? Because something's going to happen, right? Would you agree with that? Again, like nothing to the extent, hopefully, of the pandemic. But you know what? If we're not prepared for the next thing, shame on us. I mean, really, we really need to be prepared for this. This is the heavy mantle of leadership and management. And again, why people need to understand how critical it is. And we call it reinventing the workplace. And we talk about reinventing the manager. I think we need a whole different kind of manager and leader for our organizations moving forward. But when we have high psychological safety and we have high accountability, this is the learning zone. This is where we get, dirty and we get into the weeds and we boots on the ground stuff where we're actually learning from one another and we're figuring out how to make these problems go away. Or we're figuring out how to deliver our services more effectively or take care of the people that are in our in our responsibility, our sphere of care, that's the learning zone. And that's the power of psychological safety. So remember what I said. Psychological safety is the soil, and the seed are things like trust and dealing with conflict and accountability and engagement and retention. When you have that, that's when it flourishes, and we get managers out of the boss hole zone. All right, so as I begin to wrap up and conclude our discussion for today, I want to share with you sort of a visual idea of where we were and where we need to go. All right, and I want to be respectful of our time. We got about 10 minutes left, and I want to leave a little time for questions if anybody has them. So I'm going to tell you right now, in full disclosure, there's a gentleman by the name of Aaron Dignan. We just spoke at the same conference. He was a keynote, I wasn't. But we just spoke at a keynote a couple weeks ago. He has a book called Brave New Work. Amazing book. I mean, I've given you some titles from, we don't have a book. Maybe we will someday, who cares? But Brave New Work. But I saw him speak, and I'm borrowing this metaphor from him because it's so perfect for what we're talking about now. Leader versus manager versus boss hole. He talks about an old operating system by which most of us, or through which most of us were brought up in organizations. So on the right-hand side, we have a very familiar command and control type of operating system. Back at the advent of the Industrial Revolution, we had a lot of manufacturing. We were producing pieces, volume, accuracy, producing the same product over and over again. So managers and supervisors were really supposed to command and control the process. Does that make sense? Well, that was like the advent of boss holes. Okay. And we just begat boss holes generation after generation after generation. And by the way, I've heard boss holes tell me, yeah, but I learned this from my manager. That doesn't mean it was a good thing, how you treat people. All right. So when you think about that, the old command and control, it feels, we understand this, don't we? But now we are moving to a new model of trust and autonomy. Think about virtual work. Think about I'm sorry, I don't want to say old, not, chronologically old. Managers and supervisors that are kind of stuck in the boss hole zone of command and control. And now they're dealing with people that are working remotely. And then when the CDC dropped its guidelines, what are those managers asking? When are we all coming back to the workplace? Now, some of us, I get it. Some of us cannot work remotely. Some jobs can. But that's trust and autonomy. It requires a different kind of manager. Does that make sense? Okay. And if you don't think this applies to you, I'm going to give you an everyday example. All right. Would you hit one more? Okay. One more here. So let's hold it right there, Scott. Thank you. So on the left-hand side, what do you see? Stoplight, intersection, right? This is a model with which we are very familiar, right? You pull up. If the light is red, okay. If the light is yellow as you're approaching it, you slow to speed up. Thank you very much. I do too. Okay. And then when the light, so this is about very fixed rules, correct? This is a familiar model with which we have operated for generations and generations. Okay. There's a new model. And you see them all around Columbus and all around our communities right there. That is about trust and autonomy. That is about, when I say trust and autonomy, that means that when you approach, there's one rule. What's the one rule as you approach a roundabout? Stay in your lane, stay in your lane. You just stay right. Now you got to look over here, but what the model offers is the trust in you and the autonomy to learn as you're doing it. Not many people have learned this yet. But you see the difference? Old model, new model. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong impression here. That doesn't mean we abandon the old model. I don't believe in command and control management, but there are certain things that require a command and control approach, dealing with hazardous materials. You can't just sort of, whatever happens, that's okay. All right. So we have to have very specific rules. However, if we are going to help keep those managers and leaders out of the boss hole zone, we have got to learn about a model, and this is actually a continuum. You can actually see organizations applying both, but our conclusion is this: we are stuck over here. And until we free ourselves to more trust and autonomy and think of ourselves as the roundabout, or start to apply it in certain ways in our organizations, we are going to be struggling. All right? So my question to you is, on this continuum, rhetorical question, where do you see yourselves? How do you see yourselves functioning? And where do we need to break with some old models that are keeping our managers and our supervisors in the boss hole zone? It's not hard to do. Now, I have a tool for everybody. I didn't want to come here and have you go away empty-handed. If you would hit the next slide, please. Up here I have, and by the way, if you could designate one person from every table and one person from each row, I should have enough copies, and just send them on up. Okay, we need 10 people to come up here to each grab a stack of these. It's okay, go ahead, it's all right. That's it, come on up. So by the way, there we go, yes, thank you. By the way, in the event that there are not enough copies, this document is made available in your materials from the conference, okay? So just pass them around. Yep, we got 2 more up here. Grab those, thank you. All right. I know, it's a tight room. Perfect. Just grab whatever you can. Thank you so much. So this is something, actually, could you go back one, Scott? Okay, I just want to point out really quick that this is something that you can use, and I want you to feel free to make copies of it and give it to your managers and your supervisors. This is what we call the boss hole zone defense. These are 6 steps that managers should employ when they are dealing with somebody where the person's performance is in question. Don't guess, okay? Please don't guess. But give this to them. And as you read through it, it's very, very self-explanatory. But the very first thing is, does the person even understand the expectations in the role? And then help them go through this. But this is something I wanted to give you so that you could give to your managers and supervisors to keep them out of the boss hole zone. Okay, Scott, next one is fine, because we're going to wrap things up. I want to thank you all very much. We only have a couple of minutes left. If anybody has any questions, I guess we could pass the mic around, or I'm happy to answer any questions afterward. But thank you so much for the invitation. I hope this was helpful to you. And hey, let's just help those boss holes out there, okay? Thank you very much. I think we have a question. We have a question? Here we go.
Yeah, thanks, John. Would you share 1 or 2 examples of what kind of components might be in an individual contributor's pathway who doesn't have vertical aspirations?
Good. Okay, great. All right, so what we normally do is, let's just say we have some sort of an analyst or a coordinator position, somebody who is part of the machine, if you will, to make things work. We need to figure out what are those different levels of competency within that particular position. So if we have an analyst, you know, if we've just hired this person in and they've got 1 to 3 years experience, I would say, what should we expect from somebody who, you know, based on their experience, their resume, or at their level, that level in our organization? What is the level of competence? And then what's the specific output that we should expect? For example, maybe they should be able to use without any problem pivot tables within an Excel spreadsheet. They should be able to run analytics without any problem on very basic input. And then the next level would be maybe an analyst level 2 and then level 3. But what are the various competencies specific to that role that you want people to develop over time that may not have as an entry-level position, or they may hire in and they do have it and they hire in as an analyst level 3? What does that look like next? So that's a very quick way of saying the organization figuring out what are the competencies and what are the markers and the skills necessary to move them through that. Is that some guidance? Okay. I know everybody's got to get to your next session. Have a great session.
Hey, man. Yes, sir. Great presentation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, all.